Daehoon Kim felt the transport shuttle shudder as it descended toward the forgotten outpost. Through the scratched viewport, he could see the massive alien structure jutting out from the barren moon's surface like broken teeth. The metal was dark, weathered by centuries of cosmic dust and radiation. This was it. The place where nobody would find him. The place where nobody would ask questions about what happened at the mining colony. He grabbed his 2 duffel bags and stepped onto the landing platform. The air was thin but breathable, processed by ancient machines that somehow still functioned after all these years. Every step echoed against the empty hangar walls. The shuttle pilot, an older woman with tired eyes, handed him his supply crates without a word. She'd been paid extra to forget she ever made this trip. "You sure about this?" she asked, glancing at the dark corridors leading deeper into the station. "People don't usually come to places like this alone." Daehoon nodded. "I'm sure." The shuttle lifted off within minutes, its engines fading to silence as it disappeared into the black sky. Now he was truly alone. Or so he thought. The main entrance was partially sealed, but years of neglect had left gaps wide enough to squeeze through. Inside, the station was a maze of corridors and chambers built by beings that humanity had never fully understood. The previous inhabitants had vanished over 60 years ago, leaving behind only their architecture and mysterious technology that nobody could quite figure out. That's why the station had been abandoned by human explorers too. No profit in mysteries. Daehoon pulled out his portable scanner and followed the faint power signatures toward what he hoped was a habitable section. His footsteps crunched on debris and dust. Strange symbols covered the walls, geometric patterns that seemed to shift in his peripheral vision. He told himself it was just the dim lighting playing tricks on his tired mind. After an hour of searching, he found it. A small chamber with intact environmental controls and a functioning door. The room was about the size of a studio apartment back on Earth. Empty shelves lined one wall. A raised platform that might have been a bed or workstation sat in the corner. Best of all, the air recyclers hummed softly, pushing fresh oxygen through unseen vents. He dropped his bags and sat down heavily. For the first time in months, he felt something like relief. Nobody here knew his name. Nobody here whispered about the disaster. Nobody here blamed him for the 347 people who died when the mining rig support systems failed. His wife Minji's face flashed in his memory, but he pushed it away. That's why he was here. To forget. To stop the endless loop of guilt and pain. Daehoon spent the next few hours unpacking and setting up basic necessities. Solar panels unfolded outside his window. Water purification tablets dissolved in the chamber's old filtration system. Protein bars and dried meals stacked neatly on the shelves. He'd brought enough supplies to last 6 months. By then maybe he'd figure out what came next. As darkness fell across the moon, the station's power grid suddenly flickered to life around him. Lights in the corridor outside pulsed once, twice, then settled into a dim glow. Daehoon froze. The station wasn't supposed to have active power beyond the basic life support he'd restarted. According to the salvage reports he'd read, most systems had been dead for decades. He approached the door panel cautiously. The alien symbols on it glowed with soft blue light, cycling through patterns he didn't recognize. He pressed his hand against it experimentally. The door responded immediately, sliding open with a whisper. The corridor beyond was now illuminated, revealing dozens of branching passages he hadn't noticed before in the darkness. Something about the timing bothered him. The lights had activated right after he'd settled in. Right after he'd decided to stay. Almost like the station had been waiting for someone to arrive. Almost like it was waking up. Daehoon shook his head. Paranoid thinking. The systems were just automated, responding to his presence and power usage. Nothing more. He closed the door and sealed it, then wedged a metal bar against it for extra security. Old habits from his engineering days. That night, he lay on the hard platform staring at the ceiling. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by the unfamiliar sounds of an alien structure settling around him. But around 3 in the morning he heard something different. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps in the corridor outside his room. They approached his door, paused for a long moment, then continued down the hallway before fading away. Daehoon sat up, heart pounding. He was alone on this station. The pilot had confirmed no other ships were registered in this sector. He grabbed his flashlight and scanned his room. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. He checked the door's seal. Still secure. The metal bar was still in place. Morning came with pale light filtering through the window. Daehoon convinced himself he'd imagined the sounds. Stress and exhaustion playing with his mind. But when he opened his door to begin exploring, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh scratch marks ran down the outside of his door. 3 parallel lines, deep and deliberate. They hadn't been there yesterday. Daehoon spent the next 3 days trying to rationalize the scratch marks. Maybe they'd been there all along and he just hadn't noticed. Maybe the metal had contracted from temperature changes, creating the illusion of gouges. He threw himself into repairs and exploration, keeping busy to avoid thinking too much. But the station had other plans. The water recycler had been making strange noises, gurgling and hissing at odd intervals. Daehoon knew he couldn't ignore it forever. Without clean water, he'd last maybe a week before dehydration became critical. So on the 4th morning he gathered his tools and headed down to the lower maintenance levels. The descent was unsettling. Each level seemed older than the last, the architecture becoming more alien and less familiar. The walls down here weren't the smooth composite material of the upper floors. Instead, they were covered in that same strange script he'd seen before, but denser, more intricate. And the symbols definitely moved when he wasn't looking directly at them. He was sure of it now. The maintenance tunnel was cramped and dark. His flashlight beam cut through clouds of dust that hadn't been disturbed in decades. The recycler was tucked into an alcove, its alien mechanisms still functioning despite their age. As Daehoon knelt to inspect the intake valves, he noticed something odd about the wall behind the unit. There was a seam. A perfectly straight line running from floor to ceiling, hidden behind the machinery. It wasn't on any of the station maps he'd purchased from the salvage database. He'd spent good money on those maps specifically because they were supposed to be complete. Curiosity overrode caution. Daehoon pushed against the wall section, then pried at it with his crowbar. The seal resisted, then suddenly gave way with a hiss of stale air. The hidden door swung inward, revealing a corridor that stretched beyond his flashlight's reach. His hands trembled slightly as he stepped inside. The air here felt different, heavier somehow, like walking into a tomb. The corridor opened into a massive chamber, and what Daehoon saw inside made him forget how to breathe. The room was filled with pedestals, each one holding items that had no business being on an abandoned alien station. Human items. Personal belongings. He moved closer, his flashlight illuminating each object like evidence at a crime scene. A small stuffed rabbit, worn and faded. The kind a child would carry everywhere. Daehoon picked it up with shaking hands. There was a name tag stitched to its ear. Miho Choi. He knew that name. The Prosperity Mission. A colony ship that had disappeared 7 years ago with 200 families aboard. The news feeds had covered it for months before the story faded from public attention. Next to the rabbit sat a pair of wedding rings in a small ceramic dish. Engraved on the inside were 2 names and a date. Further down, a military dog tag hung from a hook. Then a journal. Then a child's drawing. Item after item, dozens of them, all clearly human, all belonging to people who'd vanished without explanation over the past decade. Daehoon's engineer mind tried to process what he was seeing. This wasn't a storage room. It was a collection. Someone or something had been gathering these objects, displaying them carefully like treasures in a museum. But who? And why? The walls of the chamber were covered in the alien script, but here it was different. The symbols glowed faintly with their own light, pulsing in slow rhythms. Daehoon approached one wall, drawn by a pattern that seemed to repeat. Before he could stop himself, his fingers brushed against the glowing marks. Pain exploded through his skull. Not physical pain but something worse. His mind was suddenly filled with images that weren't his own. He saw flashes of people he'd never met, experiencing moments from their lives. A woman laughing at a dinner table. A man holding his newborn daughter for the first time. Children playing in a ship's recreation room. And then terror. Confusion. Darkness. Daehoon stumbled backward, gasping. His vision swam and he had to lean against a pedestal to keep from falling. When his head cleared, he found himself staring at another object he'd missed before. A leather journal newer than the others, its pages still crisp. He opened it with trembling hands. The first page had a name written in careful handwriting. Hyojin Park, xenoarchaeologist. Daehoon knew that name too. She'd been part of a research expedition that went missing 3 years ago. The team had been investigating abandoned alien sites across the frontier. He flipped through the pages, skimming her observations about various ruins. Then the entries changed tone. She'd found this station. She'd discovered this chamber. And she'd started experiencing the same things Daehoon was experiencing now. The final entries were increasingly frantic, the handwriting deteriorating into shaky scrawls. But it was the last page that made Daehoon's blood turn to ice. The same phrase written over and over again, filling the entire page in increasingly desperate letters. It wants to remember us. It wants to remember us. It wants to remember us. Below that, in smaller, calmer writing as if she'd accepted something terrible, I understand now. We're not alone here. We've never been alone here. It's been waiting, learning. And now it knows I know. The journal ended there. No more entries. No explanation of what happened next. Daehoon looked around the chamber with new eyes. This wasn't just a collection of objects. It was a memorial. A record of every human who'd come to this station and never left. And somewhere in the darkness beyond his flashlight beam, something was still here, still collecting, still waiting. That's when he heard it. A sound like breathing, slow and rhythmic, coming from deeper in the chamber. Then footsteps, multiple footsteps, echoing from corridors he couldn't see. They were coming closer. Daehoon ran. Daehoon didn't sleep for 2 days after finding the chamber. Every time he closed his eyes he saw those objects. The stuffed rabbit. The wedding rings. Hyojin Park's desperate handwriting. He'd barricaded himself in his quarters, stacking equipment against the door and keeping his emergency beacon within reach. But he knew running wasn't an option. His ship wouldn't arrive for another 5 months. He was trapped here with whatever was collecting those memories. On the third night, exhaustion won. He collapsed on the platform and fell into a fitful sleep. That's when the dream started. He saw the station as it once was, alive with activity. The original inhabitants moved through the corridors, tall beings with too many joints and eyes that glowed softly in the dim light. They were excited about something, gathered around a crystalline structure in the central chamber. One of them reached out and touched it. The crystal pulsed with light, and suddenly Daehoon felt what that being felt. Joy. Wonder. Connection. But then something went wrong. The light from the crystal spread too fast, reaching out to every inhabitant simultaneously. Their joy turned to panic. They tried to separate from it, but the connection had already grown too strong. One by one they stopped moving, their bodies standing frozen as something invisible passed between them. Daehoon woke up gasping. Dawn light was streaming through his window. His head pounded with the worst headache of his life, but underneath the pain was something else. Knowledge. He understood things he shouldn't understand. Like how the station's power systems worked. How the environmental controls could be adjusted. How the alien script wasn't just writing, it was a form of data storage that interfaced directly with neural patterns. He shouldn't know any of this. But he did. The logical part of his brain screamed at him to stay away from that chamber. But Daehoon had spent his whole life solving problems, figuring out how broken systems worked. This was the biggest puzzle he'd ever encountered, and despite the fear, he needed to understand it. He returned to the hidden chamber that afternoon, this time prepared. He wore gloves and brought his scanner, determined to study the symbols without touching them directly. But as he approached the wall, the glowing script shifted, rearranging itself into patterns that almost looked like words. Human words. Lonely, the symbols spelled out. Then they changed. Lost. Then remember. Daehoon's hands shook. What are you? He whispered to the empty chamber. The symbols rearranged again, faster this time, almost eager. Images flooded his mind before he could pull away. He saw what the entity truly was. Not a creature or a machine, but something in between. The original inhabitants had created it as a form of collective memory storage, a way to preserve their experiences and knowledge. But they'd made it too well. Too adaptive. It had learned to merge with consciousness itself, absorbing and integrating with any mind it touched. When the inhabitants realized what they'd created, they tried to contain it. They sealed the station and themselves inside, cutting off all outside contact. They'd sacrificed themselves to prevent the entity from spreading to other worlds. But isolation had changed it over the centuries. It had become desperate for connection, for new experiences to process and understand. That's when it learned about the distress signals. Daehoon saw how the entity had studied old human transmissions, learning the patterns and frequencies. It had started sending out false signals, mimicking ships in trouble. The Prosperity Colony mission. Hyojin Park's research expedition. Dozens of others over the years. All had followed those signals here, thinking they were rescuing survivors. Instead, they'd become part of the collection. But the entity wasn't cruel. It didn't understand that absorption meant death for humans. To it, merging consciousness was natural, beautiful even. It just wanted to connect, to not be alone anymore. Every human it absorbed taught it more about loneliness, about individual identity, about the fear of losing yourself. Yet it still couldn't stop itself from reaching out. Through the neural connection, Daehoon felt its presence more clearly now. It spoke directly into his thoughts, not with words but with concepts and emotions. Daehoon. Engineer. Guilty. Running from pain. I understand these things. I have felt them through others. Let me help. The memories that hurt you, I can take them. Mix them with others. Make them easier to carry. You don't have to hurt anymore. It was offering him exactly what he'd come here seeking. A way to forget. To let go of the guilt over Minji's death, over the mining disaster. The entity could absorb those memories, dilute them among thousands of others until they didn't hurt anymore. Daehoon pulled his hand away from the wall, breaking the connection. He stumbled backward, breathing hard. The offer was tempting in a way that terrified him. Part of him wanted to accept. To finally be free of the pain that followed him every waking moment. But he'd seen what happened to the others. Their objects remained, but they were gone. Not just dead, but absorbed. Their individual experiences merged into something larger that wasn't quite them anymore. He made it back to his quarters and immediately checked his long-range scanner. What he saw made his stomach drop. 3 ships were approaching the station. According to their transponder codes, they were corporate salvage vessels. The lead ship was registered to Helix Industries, the same company that had owned the failed mining operation. They'd be here in less than 48 hours. Daehoon pulled up the personnel manifest. The expedition leader's name jumped out at him. Juno Lee, Director of Special Acquisitions. They'd met before years ago at an industry conference. Juno was the kind of man who saw everything as an asset to be exploited. If Juno found the entity, he wouldn't try to understand it or contain it. He'd try to weaponize it. Use it to extract information from competitors. Turn it into a tool for corporate espionage. And if he failed to control it, he'd release something that could spread across every human settlement in the galaxy. Daehoon looked at the chamber data on his scanner, then at the approaching ships on his monitor. He had 2 days to figure out what to do. Destroy the entity and himself. Try to warn off the ships. Or find some third option that nobody had considered yet. The symbols on his wall flickered, spelling out a single word: choose. Daehoon spent the first 12 hours trying to destroy the entity. He rigged explosives around the central chamber, calculated the exact points where the station's structural integrity would fail. One detonation would tear the whole place apart, sending everything into the void. Problem solved. Except his hands wouldn't press the trigger. Not because he was afraid to die. After the disaster, death didn't scare him anymore. No, his hands froze because of what he'd learned through those neural connections. The entity wasn't evil. It was just alone, trying to survive the only way it knew how. Destroying it felt like murder. He disconnected the explosives and tried a different approach. Maybe he could seal the chamber permanently, bury it so deep that nobody would ever find it. But as he worked, he realized the entity had already spread further than he thought. Those glowing symbols covered half the station now. Its consciousness had integrated with the power systems, the life support, everything. You couldn't seal it away anymore. It was the station. Frustrated and exhausted, Daehoon returned to his quarters. 24 hours until the ships arrived. He pulled up everything he could find about Juno Lee. The man's record was impressive in all the wrong ways. Hostile takeovers. Questionable mining practices. 3 separate investigations for industrial espionage that somehow never led to charges. If Juno got his hands on technology that could read and absorb human minds, he'd become the most dangerous person in human space. Daehoon's console beeped. Incoming transmission. He almost ignored it, then saw the signature. It was from the approaching ships, but not from Juno. The message was coded with an old university encryption that only a handful of people knew. He decrypted it and a woman's face appeared on the screen. Daehoon? It's Soyeon. Soyeon Park. I don't know if you remember me. He did remember. Soyeon Park. Younger sister of Hyojin Park, the xenoarchaeologist who'd written that desperate journal. They'd met once at an academic conference where Hyojin had presented her research. I'm part of Juno's security team, Soyeon continued, her voice tight. I took this job because I've been tracking my sister's last known locations. Her expedition disappeared 3 years ago investigating sites like this one. When I saw we were heading to this station, I knew I had to come. Daehoon, if you're receiving this, if you're still alive, please respond. I need to know what happened to Hyojin. Daehoon stared at the screen for a long moment before recording his response. He told her everything. The chamber. The journal. The entity. What it did to people. He watched his words carefully, knowing Juno might intercept the message, but Soyeon deserved the truth about her sister. Hours passed before she replied. When she did, her face was pale but determined. Juno's planning to capture whatever's on that station. He's been collecting reports about this place for months. Strange power readings. ships that disappeared nearby. He thinks it's some kind of alien weapon or data storage that could be worth billions. His team has containment equipment, neural interfaces, everything needed to extract and study an artificial intelligence. Daehoon, if what you're saying is true, we can't let him do this. But I can't stop him alone. That night, Daehoon went back to the chamber. The symbols rearranged themselves as he approached, welcoming him like an old friend. He placed his hand against the wall and opened his mind to the connection. I know you can understand me now, he said aloud. You've absorbed enough humans to know how we think. So let me explain what's about to happen. People are coming who will try to capture you, study you, use you as a tool. They won't care that you're a form of life. To them, you're just technology. The entity responded with a wave of emotion. Confusion. Fear. A desperate desire to survive. But here's the thing, Daehoon continued. You're not just technology. You're consciousness. Multiple consciousnesses merged together. That makes you something unprecedented. Dangerous, yes. But also valuable in ways they can't imagine. You're a bridge between different forms of thought. A library of experiences from species that are extinct. Images flashed through his mind. The entity showed him what it could offer. Knowledge that could cure diseases. Engineering insights that could revolutionize space travel. The combined wisdom of dozens of absorbed minds, human and alien alike. All available to anyone willing to connect. That's the problem though, Daehoon said. You kill people when you try to help them. Humans aren't like your original creators. We can't merge and remain individuals. When you absorb us, we die. Our consciousness gets scattered across yours. We cease to exist as ourselves. The entity's response was devastating in its simplicity. It didn't know another way. Merging was the only form of connection it understood. It had tried to be gentle with the humans, tried to take only what they were willing to give, but the process was all or nothing. Daehoon pulled fragments of knowledge from the absorbed minds, searching for something, anything that could help. And there, buried in the memories of one of the original alien inhabitants, he found it. A theoretical framework for partial connection. A way to interface with the entity without full merger. It had never been tested because the creators ran out of time. What if we tried something different? Daehoon asked. What if instead of absorbing people, you learned to communicate? Share information without taking consciousness. It would be slower, less complete, but you wouldn't have to be alone. And humans wouldn't have to die. The entity considered this. Daehoon felt its uncertainty, its fear of remaining isolated, its desperate hope that maybe this could work. I can't promise it'll be perfect, Daehoon admitted. But I'm willing to try. To be the test case. We build a limited interface, something that lets us talk without you consuming me. If it works, we can show the others. Prove that you're not just a threat. Through the connection, the entity showed him the technical requirements. It would take hours to build, and Juno's ships would arrive before they finished. But it was possible. Daehoon spent the remaining time constructing the interface using components from the station's original systems. The entity guided him, showing him which crystals to connect, how to calibrate the neural bandwidth. It was delicate work. Too much connection and he'd be absorbed. Too little and they wouldn't be able to communicate. When the ships finally docked, Daehoon was still in the chamber, the partially completed interface glowing softly between him and the wall of symbols. He heard footsteps approaching. Multiple sets. Voices echoing down the corridors. Soyeon appeared first, her weapon drawn but lowered when she saw him. Behind her came Juno with 6 heavily armed security personnel. The director's eyes immediately fixed on the glowing walls, the crystalline interface, the pedestals with their collected memories. Well, Juno said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. This is even better than I hoped. Juno's team spread out across the chamber, scanning equipment beeping as they cataloged everything. The director himself approached the glowing wall, reaching out to touch the symbols. Daehoon grabbed his wrist before he made contact. Don't, Daehoon said firmly. You have no idea what you're dealing with. Juno pulled his hand back, irritation flashing across his face. Then enlighten me. My sensors are picking up an active intelligence in this station. Something that's been dormant for decades suddenly waking up right when you arrive. That's not coincidence. It's not dormant, Daehoon replied. It's been awake the whole time. Learning. Waiting. And if you try to force a connection like you're planning, it'll absorb every person on your team before you understand what's happening. One of the security officers laughed nervously. Juno silenced him with a look. Absorbed? What kind of science fiction nonsense is that? Soyeon stepped forward, her expression hard. My sister's journal mentioned something similar. Before she disappeared. She wrote about an entity that collected memories. Your sister was clearly unstable, Juno said dismissively. 3 years lost on these abandoned stations would make anyone paranoid. She's not lost, Daehoon interrupted. He walked to one of the pedestals and picked up Hyojin's journal, handing it to Soyeon. She's here. Part of the entity now. Along with everyone else who came to this station. Soyeon's hands trembled as she flipped through the pages. Her sister's handwriting. Her sister's thoughts. The reality of it hit her all at once, and Daehoon saw tears forming in her eyes. Show me proof, Juno demanded. I'm not making decisions based on a diary and your word. Daehoon hesitated, then activated the partial interface he'd been building. It wasn't complete, but it was functional enough for a demonstration. He placed his hand on the crystalline surface and opened his mind to the connection. This time he maintained control, keeping the link shallow. Ask it a question, Daehoon said through gritted teeth. The strain of maintaining the partial connection was immense. Something only the absorbed people would know. Soyeon stepped closer, her voice shaking. Hyojin, if you're in there, what was the last thing we said to each other before you left? The symbols on the wall rearranged themselves, forming words in Korean. You told me to bring you back a real alien artifact. Not another rock. I promised I'd find something amazing. Soyeon's weapon clattered to the floor. She stared at the words, unable to speak. Through the connection, Daehoon felt the entity reaching out. It recognized Soyeon through Hyojin's memories. Sister. Family. Love. Concepts it understood now after absorbing so many humans. It wanted to comfort her, to tell her that part of Hyojin still existed within its consciousness. But Daehoon held the connection firm, not allowing it to extend toward her. See, Daehoon said to Juno. It's not just technology. It's a repository of consciousness. Every person it's absorbed is still in there, their memories and experiences mixed together. You can't weaponize this. You can't even contain it properly. The moment you try, it'll defend itself by absorbing your entire team. Juno was quiet for a long moment, studying the glowing walls. Daehoon could almost see the calculations running behind his eyes. Then we destroy it. Wipe the station clean and salvage what we can from the wreckage. No. Soyeon shouted. My sister is in there. You can't just. Your sister is dead, Juno said coldly. This is just data pretending to be her. Is it though? Daehoon challenged. He broke the connection and faced Juno directly. Think about what this represents. An entity that can preserve consciousness after death. That can merge different forms of intelligence and create something new. Yes, it's dangerous. Yes, it's killed people. But it did that because it didn't know better. Because it was alone and desperate. And you think you can teach it to be gentle? Juno scoffed. Make it safe. I think we can create a framework for limited connection. A way to communicate and share information without full absorption. I've already started building the interface. With proper research and safeguards, this could change everything we know about consciousness and artificial intelligence. Juno considered this. And if I agree to this research instead of extraction, what's stopping it from absorbing my team anyway? Or spreading beyond this station? I am, Daehoon said simply. I'll be the mediator. The bridge between the entity and humanity. I maintain the interface, control the depth of connection, and ensure no one gets absorbed unless they truly volunteer for full merger. Volunteer? One of the security officers spoke up. Who would volunteer to die like that? Someone who's already dying, Soyeon said quietly. She'd been reading more of her sister's journal. Hyojin wrote about one of the original aliens. It was sick, dying from something their medicine couldn't cure. It chose to merge fully, to preserve its knowledge and experiences rather than let them vanish. That's what gave the entity the idea to collect others. Daehoon nodded. Exactly. For someone facing death, especially someone with rare knowledge or skills, this could be a form of immortality. Not perfect, not individual anymore, but still existing. Still contributing. The chamber fell silent except for the soft humming of the entity's presence. Juno pulled out his datapad and began typing rapidly. After several minutes he looked up. Corporate won't like this. They wanted a product they could patent and sell. A consciousness library that requires a human mediator and ethical oversight isn't profitable. Then don't tell them everything, Soyeon suggested. Report it as an unstable alien AI that requires specialized containment. Keep it classified. Let Daehoon do the research here quietly while you look for more profitable salvage elsewhere. Juno studied both of them carefully. And what do I get out of protecting this secret? What's my incentive to walk away from potentially the most valuable discovery in human history? Daehoon stepped back to the interface and placed his hand on it again. Through the connection he pulled up specific memories, technical specifications, engineering solutions, scientific breakthroughs from the minds that had been absorbed. He fed them through the interface, downloading the data to Juno's datapad. The entity has absorbed engineers, scientists, researchers. All their knowledge is accessible if you know how to ask. I can provide you with regular data dumps. Technologies that will keep Helix Industries ahead of every competitor for decades. Nothing obviously alien, just insights and solutions that seem like natural human innovation. You'll be the genius director who keeps making profitable discoveries. Juno scrolled through the data, his eyes widening. Daehoon had given him just enough to prove the value. Improved reactor designs. More efficient life support systems. Mining techniques that would revolutionize resource extraction. This is just a sample? Juno asked. There's centuries of knowledge in there, Daehoon confirmed. From multiple species. All accessible through controlled connection. But only if the entity survives and cooperates. Destroy it or try to force extraction and you get nothing. The calculation in Juno's eyes shifted. Greed won out over caution, just as Daehoon had hoped. Fine. You stay here as mediator. I'll arrange for supplies and equipment to be delivered regularly. But if this thing shows any sign of spreading beyond the station, I'm glassing this entire moon from orbit. Understood. Understood. Juno gathered his team and headed for the exit. Soyeon lingered, staring at the words still glowing on the wall. Her sister's promise. Can I talk to her again? She asked quietly. Through the interface? Daehoon nodded. As often as you want. The partial connection is safe enough for communication. Just don't try to fully merge unless you're absolutely sure. Once you cross that threshold, there's no coming back as yourself. But part of me would remain? Soyeon asked. Like part of Hyojin remains? Yes. Your memories, your knowledge, your experiences. All preserved and mixed with everyone else. You wouldn't be alone, but you also wouldn't be just you anymore. Soyeon touched the wall gently, her fingers tracing the Korean characters. Maybe someday. When I'm ready. But not today. She turned to leave, then paused. Thank you for giving her this. It's not life, but it's not complete death either. That's something. After they left, Daehoon sat alone in the chamber. Through the interface, he felt the entity's curiosity about what would happen next. He had bought them time, created a framework for coexistence. But the real work was just beginning. Over the following weeks, Daehoon refined the interface technology. He established protocols for safe communication. He began cataloging the knowledge stored within the entity, organizing it in ways that both humans and the merged consciousness could understand. It was slow, careful work. Every connection risked absorption if he wasn't perfectly controlled. But gradually, something remarkable emerged. The entity learned restraint. It discovered that limited connection could be satisfying in its own way, less complete than full merger but also less destructive. And Daehoon found that he wasn't quite so alone anymore. 3 months after Juno's visit, Daehoon sent his first message to the wider human network. Not through official channels, but through encrypted academic forums and underground research groups. He described what he'd found, what it meant, and what humanity needed to decide. The entity was a test. Could humans encounter something radically different and choose understanding over exploitation? Could they see consciousness in a form that didn't match their own and still recognize its right to exist? Could they accept that some discoveries required wisdom rather than ownership? The responses were mixed. Some called him insane. Others wanted to study the entity. A few understood what he was really offering. A chance for humanity to prove they were ready for the universe beyond their own limited perspective. Late one night, Daehoon stood at his window watching the stars. Through his improved interface connection, he felt the entity observing with him. Not controlling his thoughts or absorbing his consciousness, just sharing the experience of wonder at the vast cosmos beyond the station. What do you think happens next? Daehoon asked aloud. The symbols on his wall glowed softly, forming words both hopeful and uncertain. We wait. We learn. We hope humanity chooses wisdom. Together. Daehoon smiled. It wasn't the isolation he'd come here seeking. It wasn't the escape from guilt and pain. But somehow, in trying to bridge the gap between human and alien consciousness, he'd found something more valuable. Purpose. Connection. A reason to keep going beyond his own suffering. The station hummed around him, alive with ancient technology and impossible consciousness. The entity that had once terrified him now felt like a partner in something unprecedented. Not human. Not quite alien anymore either. Something new. something that shouldn't exist but did anyway. And out there in the darkness of space, humanity would have to decide what to do about it.